I know a lot of you guys probably don't know me because I do not, in fact, work at Here House, but I do work at Here House from time to time. My name is Ashley Grimmel, and I have been a Here House member for 3 years now. And for those of you who have not been here, welcome. For those of you who have been here, welcome back. I always like to think of this space as kind of like the community living room, which I really love. So tonight, super excited to build on that community and having such a special event for Aspen and really for us as a community. And for those of you who aren't familiar with what Here House is, it is a community space. Some people use it as a co-working space, which I certainly do. It's also a space to kind of use as like a living room. You know, Aspen, there's not a lot of places with a lot of space for us to really unwind, including our homes. So this is where we come to connect with one another, to build on what it is that makes Aspen so amazing. Community, right? So I want to take an opportunity to welcome you guys. While I, like I said, do not work here, I'm standing in for Michaela, who is just a superstar human. And if you are interested in learning more about this space, feel free to grab a card. You can obviously check out the website, reach out that way, or if you have questions, I've been here a long time. I'm happy to answer anything you guys might have to ask. So I will now hand this over to Skippy so that he can properly introduce this evening. But welcome, everyone. Super happy you're here, and welcome to our living room.
Thank you, Ashley.
Thanks, Skippy.
So many friendly faces in the crowd, so many faces that have had a real hand in cultivating this magical, magical place. None more than the men on this stage. This is really an honor for me. I'm so grateful to be here with you all. I want to start tonight, just a very brief intro. We'll do some very short bios, and then we're really going to let these gentlemen speak from experience. I've been carrying this around with me for the last couple months. This is Joe's platform when he ran for mayor back in '69, co-created, as we would say today, with the Citizens for Community. This document, as I understand it, and these are just my words and they may have other interpretations throughout the night, this was really the first time that initial Elizabeth and Walter Pepka vision was put into policy, because at the time, the economic forces and the significant rate of change required people to stand up and insist that this vision continue. And we find ourselves at another time of really dramatic change. Many people are not aware of this platform. 50% of our voter base has turned over just since 2012. Others may be aware of it, but time has whitewashed the effort as an inevitability, something that was obvious, something that just happened. But I think, as you'll come to find out tonight, if you don't know already, that wasn't the case. And the best way we can prepare for our future is to understand our past. So with that, some very brief introductions. First, immediately to my left, Joe Edwards. Joe is a lawyer by trade. The internet says he likes motorcycles, hot rods, sports cars, so do I, and slow sailboat rides. In 1967, Joe was the lead lawyer in the hippie trials, and we'll talk about what that is if that's not something familiar to you. He, as aforementioned, in 1968, along with Dwight Shellman, created a platform with the Citizens for Community. In 1968, ran for mayor, supported by none other than Hunter S. Thompson. He led a petition that ultimately led to the creation of our walking malls. In 1972, he ran and became commissioner in Pitkin County, where him, Dwight, and Michael later ultimately put in place just about every effort of that initial platform. The trails, the bike system, wildlife protection, open space, significant downzoning, and prohibited billboards is another fun one that we don't even think about these days. He was also leading the effort in 1976 to not have the Olympics come here and all the change that would come with that. He remains in the valley with his 4 children. I see at least 1 in the room. 2 in the room. Thank you. I saw at least 1, but there are 2. To his left, Michael Kinsley. Michael is a poli-sci major and whole systems thinker. Initially arrived as a worker bee with titles such as dishwasher, prep cook, and in an only Aspen way, also biological researcher. In 1971, he led an environmental task force which opposed the haystack and marble ski areas and focused intently on water rights issues well before the time. He worked on the campaign of Joe's as well as Dwight's and soon-to-be Mayor Stacey Stanley. In 1974, he was appointed to join Dwight and Joe as commissioner and really led the charge on affordable housing, our single biggest issue of today. In 1983, he founded the Rocky Mountain Institute, which has worked with over 40 states and in a number of countries. And of course, he is also an accomplished painter, artist, and community diplomat to round out the pedigree. Last but certainly not least, Bill Kane, master's in planning and landscape architecture. In 1974, he became the planning director for both Aspen and Pitkin County simultaneously. Big job. In that way, he was really the tip of the spear for all the policy that these gentlemen wanted to get done, including downzoning, the creation of growth management system, and founding the Affordable Housing Authority. Leaving that job in '84, he was a partner at Design Workshop. It goes from there. '96, VP of Planning at SkiCo. 2009, jumped into the fray as a town manager of Basalt, and he now has a small, anonymous role as the mayor of Basalt, where he currently sits. The board list goes on, but also co-chaired the Mobility Lab, which has led to much of our policy for the Upper Valley EOTC, and remains living in Basalt. So with that, I'm going to start kind of chronologically, and then we're going to zoom out and ask some questions for everyone, and there will be time for Q&A as well, so sit tight. So Joe, I want to start with your arrival in Aspen. I would like for you to imagine, if everyone was to kind of close their eyes in a meditative fashion, paint us the picture of what town felt like, smelled like, seemed like. Transport us back to that time. What was it like?
I first came here in 59 or 60, I can't remember which. I was on my way to Yellowstone and was right over there at the base of the mountain, and there were no paved streets, all gravel, and most small towns, if you're not growing hay or cows, you don't have much relationship with the people, but it felt so cool to be just watching the people. Most people seem to be about 20 to 35 or 40, college educated, and happy as a clam. Everybody was smiling, and I saw these girls, 2 of them, jump into a World War II Jeep and have their shepherd jump in the back and laughing and running off in that direction right at the foot of the mountain. And I thought, God, everybody seems really happy here. And you don't see that in most small towns. And it seemed like everybody was 20 to 30 or 40 years old at the most. I'm sure there were some old-timers older than that, but at the time it just seemed like such an alive, vibrant, full of people that were, I don't know if they looked like they'd been to college, just having a lot of fun. And I was sort of blown away. There was none of the commercialism you normally see in towns, where you come to a town and there's a little mall and, whatever. There wasn't any of that here, and it just seemed so cool. And I was only here a couple of days and went on to Yellowstone, came over Independence, one lane, Jeep road. I was in a Volkswagen and had to back up if you met anybody going the other way. But it was an amazing experience.
So fast forward a little bit, it's 67, and presumably all of that is still happening, but you begin to observe, perhaps let's call it the undercurrent of society and how certain people are being treated. And this leads to what is called the hippie trials. If you could give us, in brief, what was that? How did it come about? And what was the transformation that resolved in town at the conclusion of that in a relatively thumbnail version?
Okay, I visited several times and then finally moved here in 67. Took the bar exam. I was already licensed down in Texas where I came from. And I'd been practicing law with an attorney by the name of Frank Johnson, who later went crazy. He thought he was Captain America. But I'd been there for a couple of months, and into my office walked two of the physicists from the Aspen Physics Institute that has seminars here every summer. And they had passed the hat amongst their group and raised $179 and wanted me to investigate the proceedings at the municipal court and asked me if I was familiar with it, which I wasn't. I had my head in the books for clients' business. So I went over to the municipal court, and Guido Meyer, who used to own Guido's restaurant down the street, was the judge. And they brought in this kid who was in blue jeans only, no shirt. Turned out later he was about 15 years old. He was crying, two burly policemen on each side of him. And he was arrested for hitchhiking. And Guido Meyer said, you dirty hippies are messing up our business, and we're going to run you out of town. And he sentenced him to 3 months in jail for hitchhiking. And it turned out they had, I hadn't really been aware of all of that, studying for the bar here. But I looked into it, and they had 6 kids in that same age group, one of which was a girl, that had been sent to jail for 3 months for essentially nothing, either vagrancy, hitchhiking, or blocking the streets were the 3 main charges alleged against those people. And they hadn't really done anything, but the police and the police magistrate was responding to a petition that had been given to the city council by the Aspen Chamber and Visitors Bureau, urging them to, in effect, drive the hippies out of town. And there were some hippies in town. You would see them, playing their flutes and sitting around, but, it seemed a little heavy-handed. So with that $179 fee and my just being out of a constitutional law course in my senior year and feeling righteous about all this, we decided to file the first civil rights suit. The Civil Rights Act had just been passed by President, and that's what we did. We got a hold. A friend of mine had just completed a course at Penn State with Anthony Amsterdam and I can't think of the other professor, but we called them, and they helped us draft the first Colorado civil rights case that was ever filed. And we sued the city of Aspen and the Aspen Police Department and the magistrate for violating the act, which says you can't discriminate against a particular group of people. and they had. And so that's what happened. And we went over to Denver. And I don't know if you've ever been to the Denver District Court, but there's about a 3-story high marble slab, and he sits on a bench that's higher than the curtain rod over there. And there's me on one side and 6 lawyers from 2 law firms defending the city. And when we put Guido Meyer on the stand, he definitely stood by his principles and said, yes, I sentenced them because we got to get these dirty hippies out of here. They're ruining our business. Well, that pretty much made my case. And that was the first time I'd ever been in court, except for my own divorce when my wife left me down in Texas. So that was the hippie trial, and what the judge did is the people representing the city promised that the city had stopped this and they would not resume it again. And the judge said, since the city has promised to cease this activity, I'm not going to issue an injunction. But he gave me his home telephone number and said, if any of this resumes, call me and I will sign the injunction against the city. And that was pretty much it. But as a result of that, I became known as the hippie lawyer around town. And I suddenly got a lot of business in the form of marijuana arrests and that sort of thing.
A lot of money in that, right?
Not a lot. Anyway, that's how I got public notoriety in the first instance and my first appearance in court.
That's great. Really great. So I'm going to come back to you, Joe, because we're going to move chronologically. You guys are a couple years out. We're going to get there. But Joe, so you move from this, you kind of build your presence in the community. And then you and Dwight engage in the creation of this platform with the Citizens for Community. So can you share with us, first of all, who are the Citizens for Community? How are you talking to them? What does this process look like? And how did you come to final consensus? And what was that consensus? And I'll give you a little cheat sheet here in case you need it.
Well, what happened was in one summer, Aspen Square and North Nell were built. And before that, your experience out just about where we are, I mean, we're sitting where I think it was a Texaco station was it? And your experience of the mountain was completely different than it is now. I mean, the skiers came right down to the street out there. In the summer, you took your lunch up on the hill and sat down and ate lunch. And it's like the mountain was in your face when you walked around downtown. It was really, really cool. We used to take cardboard in the winter and slide down and cross the street at night when we were drinking too much. But it was amazing to be in town, and here's the mountain. And suddenly, those two buildings completely obscured that experience. And a lot of people were really not pleased with that. Even the existing mayor, it was Bugsy Barnard at the time, who was a kind of a wild man of his own, tried to revoke the building permit for Aspen Square because of this. And he lost that case. The contractors sued him. He was basing it on the inadequacy of the municipal plant to process the sewage from it. But that really coalesced some people to really start thinking hard about the zoning and planning or lack thereof. And it was Bob Lewis and Robin Molney and Fritz Benedict and who else was there? Anyway, they got together and decided to, they hired Dwight to organize the town and try to find out what everybody wanted to do. And they called themselves the Citizens for Community Action. They were meeting at, let's see, I can't remember whose house it was, but yeah, Katie was there. There was about a half a dozen strong citizens. The guy who wrote the Luke Short books was there. Anyway, they asked Dwight to figure out how to organize the town. And what he came up with was each precinct, they had like 6 different precincts, would put an ad in the paper: on Tuesday night at so-and-so's house, there will be a meeting of Precinct 1, and the discussion will involve zoning or whatever else was involved in what the community wanted to do. And they did that for a period of about 3 months. And I and Dwight or one of us would monitor those sessions and go through the various things that were being talked about. And they came up with this various precincts wanted things, but they had a list of all the things they came up with. And they were discussing employee housing, preventing scenic views from being obscured by the buildings, like green belts, trails, metropolitan government, a whole range of issues. And by that process, and then they held a grand convention at Pitkin Auditorium of they call themselves the Citizens for Community Action. So anybody could participate. If you were in Precinct 1, you went to the Precinct 1 meetings, and you voted on this whole list of considerations for the town. And by this process, started by just individual citizens and developed just by individual citizens in their various precincts, they came to the convention and came up with a platform. And if anybody wants a copy, I Xeroxed some copies of the Citizens for Community Action in 1968. And I can hand those out later.
Pass them around.
But if anybody wants some. But it was a whole range of things that were going to be done. And then there was a city council election coming up. And various people would or would not endorse that. And I got involved because that group, of which Hunter Thompson was a member, the formative group that was meeting to start it in the first place, he called me one night at about 3 a.m, because he usually worked at night, and asked me to run for mayor on this platform that had been developed by the Citizens for Community Action. And so, we met at the Wheeler following a movie of the revolution in Algeria, and when the French suppressed that very hard, and went over to the Drome, had a few beers, and he talked me into running for mayor. So that's the story of that.
That's great. And you guys will see in this as well, but I'll just give you some Cliff's notes in case there's not enough to go along. So this included open space in new developments, employee housing for the first time, preserving scenic views and sightline corridors, green belt and green area and open space along Highway 82, undergrounding all utilities, which is something that came up at a council meeting recently that really transformed town in a way we take for granted entirely. Restricting to prevent establishment of incompatible industries, so keeping industry out of town, the acquisition of parks, open space, and greenbelt, getting the first planning director in and bringing that in, anti-pollution, assistance to the school district, all of it, right?
That material's going to be on the quiz later.
That's right, that'll be on the quiz later. Now, so what's interesting to me, and this will be the last follow-up with you, Joe, and I'll move to Michael and we'll come back, is, and this is just my observation, you know, I see the two most impactful elections in the history of Aspen in terms of the change they brought to the town for the positive, at least in the retrospective, as Joe's run for mayor and Hunter's for sheriff. And interestingly, both losing campaigns. So what I'm curious about, Joe, is you spend all this time building consensus, you're in the community, you've got a platform, and yet very, very narrowly, I don't want to give away the punchline of how many votes, you lose. And so can you share with us what were the different sort of factions or interests? What were the dynamics at play that ultimately led to a temporary loss in that election, but I would say a really great victory for Aspen?
Well, you know, I had notoriety among the younger people in town because of the hippie trial, and so it was a fun campaign. Actually, we had radio ads where the Battle Hymn of the Republic would play, and then Bill Greed would come on, and he said, "Bill Greed of Bill Greed Enterprises, don't vote for Edwards. He's going to stop me from building my buildings," and, you know, kind of facetious stuff like that. It was actually quite a bit of fun. Well, you know, what was her name? Eve Homeyer. She endorsed this same platform that the Citizens for Community Action had developed, and Lenny Oates was running under the auspices of Bugsy Barnard, who was the then mayor. And Eve was at that time a Republican. She later changed to be a Democrat, but she was a good person. I mean,
Did that to her.
she wasn't bad. She was okay, but the council that was elected had all endorsed the Citizens for Community Action platform, which had been developed by consensus of the whole town. I wound up losing. It was quite hostile. If you want to get a picture of it, read Hunter's article called "The Battle of Aspen," which was the first thing he ever wrote for the Rolling Stone. And the whole picture, the whole entire story of the Battle of Aspen also appears in several of his paperback books. But it was, there were confrontations at the polls. There were, it was touch and go there for a while. And I actually would have won if the city, the county clerk knew that a lot of the kids, the younger voters, were surfing. This was an election in the off season and weren't in town, and so could only vote by absentee ballot. So she was supposed to mail the ballots out within a certain time frame, but she didn't. She deliberately delayed mailing them out, and we would have won, I would have won, if she had timely mailed them based on the ones that came in a few days late. It was a very hostile environment there at the polls, and but life goes on. It worked out, and the council was supportive of the citizens' platform.
Thank you for that. So, Michael, I want to shift over to you. You arrive on the scene sort of at the tail end of this campaign and get involved right away. But let's fast forward a little bit. So, you know, you've done your environmental work. You've kind of worked some of the odd jobs that you describe. And you've been appointed to county commissioner with Joe and Dwight, and you worked on those campaigns. So just sort of in that 4-year span, can you describe for us a little bit about how you viewed the different groups, sort of the old boys network versus the newbies? Maybe paint for us, you know, where did these people hang out? What was their background or history? You know, how did they arrive at the condition in which they were separated politically, perhaps?
So, by the way, just one thing on the intro, I was not a founder of Rocky Mountain Institute. I was just an early employee. That's a big matter with some people, like the wife of the founder right over there.
Moderator, faux pas. Blame me.
Right.
Don't trust everything you read on the internet, folks.
Right. Yeah. So what was the question? I don't remember the question. There was definitely a clear division between the progressives and the conservatives, but the truth was that was an overly simplistic division. I mean, there was a lot of people in the middle, as is always the case. But in general, the progressives hung out at the Jerome. That's kind of where we strategized for Joe and Dwight's campaign. With, by the way, Hunter's then wife was very, very much part of that campaign. And the conservatives, what we regarded as the rednecks, were the red onion. So that was sort of the division in town. It was literally the case that the twain never met. None of the progressives ever went to the onion, and none of the conservatives ever went to the Jerome. That was sort of the way the thing divided out. And in many ways that was unfortunate, because there were a lot of folks in the middle. There was a long history that I didn't know. And by the way, when I became a commissioner, I'd been here 5 years, and I didn't do any of the study about the history that you are doing. So I commend you for that. I didn't know squat about what happened in the 60s here. But there was a lot of really interesting intellectual, progressive folks who were at the core of this community in those days, who were sort of a silent supporters, not all silent, supporters of the progressives as Joe and Dwight came up in their work. And some of that was manifest in the Citizens for Community Action, which predated me. I didn't get here until November of '70, right after Hunter's loss. And the progressives were a broad range of people who mainly, a lot of whom were newcomers, not all. Again, some of those people had been around for a long time, who were people like Joan Lane, you know, who was a classic intellectual who was holed up in her house down in what's now called Shady Lane. That's a whole story how that got named. So does that go to your question?
No, that's great. And I will also be annoying and just say, kind of got to eat the microphone for that camera to pick you up for GrassRoots feed. So you end up on the county commission. You're appointed. Walk us through that process. You know, Max being there first. You know, kind of what was the chronology and the event that led to your appointment to this very storied group of commissioners?
So I ran in the election following the election in which Joe and Dwight were elected. So that left one conservative. There was only 3 county commissioners in those days. That left one conservative on the board, which was Jay, right? Yeah. Well, yeah, but then that's not what I'm talking about. I'm talking who was there. Max Mesirow was decided to run for that seat, as did I, as did Bobby Berthud, and as did another guy whose name I don't remember. He wasn't in town very long. He was a Republican. And that's not; those aren't connected. Those two aren't connected. But Max was, I didn't know him at all, but he was a real community hero. He'd been here his whole life. He was an Olympic skier, and he was a great guy. And you all know his sons. Two of his sons are great mountaineers, and one is a great columnist. So it's a great family. He was a terrific guy, and he was a very conservative guy. He believed in a very limited role of government, which is a legitimate point of view. And he pretty much thought that everything that Joe and Dwight was doing was really awful. And so we ran. I split the vote with Bobby Berthud. Max won. He then had some health problems. He had a heart attack and quit. And in those days, the replacement for any commissioner departing was by the governor. So the governor, Dick Lamb at the time, who was a good friend of Dwight Shellman at the time, he asked the local Democratic Party to give him 3 names. And so we went through a whole precinct process for figuring out who those 3 names were. That would take about an hour to tell that story, and it was pretty interesting, but way too detailed for this conversation. And so I was one of the 3, and probably primarily thanks to Dwight and Joe, the governor appointed me in Max's place, a very different point of view. Max was, I think, probably not happy when he was on the board that brief time, but a great guy. Is that?
Yeah, no, that's great.
Yeah.
And you're building a perfect bridge to Bill. So I'm gonna go over here. So now we've got 3 ideologically aligned county commissioners. Zealots, yeah, 3 ideologically aligned zealots. And enter stage Bill as the planning director for both Aspen and Pitkin County, charged with actually putting this stuff into law, into legislation, into action, into implementation. And in a community that has some parts of it with consensus, but others strongly opposed. And I think in our pre-conversation, you used some of the terms that the process was cockeyed, unorthodox, out there, and fiery. So I'm gonna pick on, one of the most impactful things that was done, which was the downzoning. And so, you effectively go from a fairly dense allowance to AF2 down to RS 160. So tell us what that mumbo jumbo means, first of all, what the difference to the community could have been in the original zoning versus the current, and then tell us the story of in a reasonably concise manner, what that process was like.
So I would love to start with...
Maybe that might be off.
Is this working?
Yeah,
Okay.
You gotta kind of eat it.
Cool. So I'm going to comment about the bevy of land use regulations and innovations, which were all legal, right?
Ultimately determined. That's right.
So it's hard to go into this without painting a little bit of a picture of what the context was and I just picked a benchmark year, which was near and dear to my heart, which is 1975. So what was Aspen like, and what did it feel like, and what was this magical, incredible place? And it's even to this day, I mean, we are here, we've been here for 50 years, and it's emotional for me to talk about those years, just because we were all at that special place at we were all at the right place at the right time. But 1975, working again, not working. Working, okay. So picture yourself, 1975, you approach Aspen, it's nighttime, it's Highway 82 was known as Killer 82. So this was a road that was 2 lanes. Remember that? So you approached Aspen on a 2-lane highway. In the middle of winter, invariably at night, you would see oncoming cars. The headlights would shine off the ice on the highway as you approached up and down the valley. So that was our transportation system. We had no high-speed lifts. Our hospital was in a kind of modified lodge structure over on the other side of town at the base of Red Mountain, if you remember that. The solarium, spent some time there myself. And the medical field, we had 4 docs, I think, in town. You went to Jay Baxter or Witt or Barry Mink, and I think I was pretty much it. So we had your identity was tied, I think, and it's not an exaggeration. I think it is really true that you were known to people in town not only by maybe where you worked, but it was important to know which bar you supported in town. So the bars were, it was, either you hung out at the Onion, you hung out at the Jerome bar, which was a good spot. There was a definite interesting subculture at the pub, which was down below the Wheeler Opera House, which was pretty sketchy to go in and out from times. It was, there were rumors of unconfirmed rumors of recreational drugs that occurred at the pub, and we had unlimited music. So music was everywhere, and it happened. You'd get a 1-week notice to go hear Jimmy Buffett and John Denver at the Def Camp picnic. So, and you just show up, and these guys were here all the time.
Read Sandy Monroe's book, Aspen Unstrung. It characterizes that in great detail.
And Bobby Mason and Starwood, Jan Garrett, Liberty. I mean, we just had endless access to live music, and it was unbelievably fabulous. So there was a lot we didn't have. We really didn't have the term affordable housing didn't exist. We just had housing situations. So that's the way people talked about it, like, what's your situation? So anybody that's ever lived in ed beds, that would be like a typical housing situation. You're only there temporarily, right? That was the housing. So it was a young town. It was in '75, and there was a lot that we didn't have in Aspen, but I would dare say there was not one soul that wanted any more. We didn't want any more. We wanted to save what we had. This was an incredibly remarkable place and time, and it's going to change. We saw the money. I think Aspen has gone through, 6 or 7 sort of surges of what you would call in macroeconomics foreign investment, but it's kind of what it was. And I remember '75 itself was a big one, and '79 and '81, and so you had a town that people loved living in, and we just didn't want these gorgeous ranches and outlying properties and open spaces to become cookie-cutter subdivisions, become anywhere USA. So from '74 to '78, we did the following. One, we did comprehensive downzonings of the city of Aspen. That was in '75, and in Pitkin County, which, I look at Joe Edwards, I just can't tell you what kind of courage that took. We were downzoning the Stanley Nadel and the Wagner ranches in Woody Creek, and I went to a meeting, and I was there to explain it all to them. And so this was really an interesting time, and I went down with a couple staffers from the county planning department, and we met Stanley Nadel. And I said, morning, blah, blah, blah. We were there. He was going to show us. He said, you can't possibly rezone my property unless you do me the honor, the dignity of coming down here and let me tour you and show you everything I did by hand here over the list. So it was a damn serious encounter. It was not casual. And so I got out of the car and walked over to him, and we did the introductions. And he said, "Are you nervous?" And I said, No, I'm good." And he said, "Well, you should be." And we had coffee at his house, and he explained as to how they were not going to tolerate, these changes in zone district. So we did this downzoning. Then we connived. We didn't connive. We planned carefully with the state to adopt a bill called 1041, which Joe and Dwight were very instrumental in. We worked hard with the governor's office, and the state did it. They got past the legislature, and the governor pushed hard for it. But in 1041 gave us the ability to do an inventory of the environment of our valley. So in a short period of time, we were able to identify areas of statewide concern. This sounds pretty techie. It really wasn't. It was basically, we got a chance to map prime agricultural soils, wildlife, steep slopes. We mapped high hazard flood areas, wetlands, and on and on. And we were able to identify all these areas as critical areas of statewide concern. And 1041 gave us the tools to preempt a lot of very bad development ideas that were coming our way. So we did downzonings, we did 1041, then we did the growth management plan, which was, I remember doing updates and reports from my county commissioners every month, and they always said the same thing: hurry up. Get this thing going here. And so we, at that time, there was only one municipality unit of local government in the country that had experimented with doing growth control quotas, and that was Petaluma, California. So we designed a growth management system and created an annual application process and an annual quota both in the city of Aspen and Pitkin County for residential, commercial, and lodging. So that lives to today. I'm thrilled to hear. I know the county has fired up another growth management commission. They're working today. They're 25. They're meeting right now. They're meeting tonight. So this is ongoing, and that's heartwarming to see that happening. In the city of Aspen, we did the SPA because we were worried about underlying zoning, so we adopted a thing called specially planned areas. I'm sure you're plenty tired of seeing SPA applications. So we did the downzoning, we did growth management in Aspen, we did the 80-30 green line, really a cool thing because we had all these land use applications, and 80-30 was the elevation at which water service could be provided by gravity. So we basically drew a hard line and made sure that that there would be no development above 80-30, and that stopped the creep of houses. So the big development challenges came in waves and in phases. We did the Aspen Institute plan. Hans Grominger was a constant, interesting character. Remember Hans and the revolving restaurant?
Yeah, can you tell us a little bit about this and sort of? I think it's interesting because our process now can be very extended.
Yeah.
And so it's interesting to see how it relates to the process then. So tell us about how long Hans's project took and maybe the different iterations, just in brief.
My recollection is that Hans started in the early 70s, and his dream was to build a revolving restaurant, a night-lit restaurant that was going to be built up on the top of Shadow Mountain, right at the Silver Queen. I mean, this was going to be... Yeah. And so he, in order to, display his confidence and his sincerity in building this thing, he bought, an incredibly expensive wire rope, tram rope, the haul rope that was going to build this. He started having all of the pieces parts for this tram show up, and it was all starting to get stockpiled at the base of his land over there. So he filed an application. I think, was it in the county? I can't remember. It was the city. It was in the county. And so we said, no, we're not doing this in Aspen. We'll explain to you in more detail later, but basically get ready for no, because that's not really, compatible with either the city county's comprehensive planning objectives here. And so, but he didn't give up, and it went on and on and on. And I think that we had applications in and out over 10 years maybe. I mean, it just.
10 years. Yeah.
And then, he passed away, I think, was basically the ultimate. I don't think the application was ever withdrawn.
Wow.
So that was a pretty fascinating. But it was an argument about, as all of these development deals were, it was an argument about the soul of what this place is about.
Yeah.
Are we going to exploit it for glitz and commercial gain, or is this just going to be an incredibly cool, environmentally preserved special place on the earth? And these were emotional damn arguments. I mean, a lot of people cared a lot.
Yeah, and they still do,
Yeah.
luckily. That's amazing. So, bringing both sort of blunt force instruments and scalpels to the fight,
Right.
which is really a comprehensive approach. Joe, we've had conversations previously where you've kind of explained to me what would have been possible, right? Without all of the blunt force instruments and scalpels, what might this valley have looked like? And maybe can you paint for us a picture of some of what we might now see as more egregious projects that were proposed but not finished?
Aspen Post case,
Well, what comes to mind is 41,000 people at Wildcat, which 7-story buildings were proposed out there. And we rezoned that area to 1 unit per 35 acres. And Owl Creek was already zoned 55 units an acre, population of about 500,000. And we downzoned that to 1 unit per 35 acres. You can imagine.
So I got to tell you something there. I was a strong supporter of Joe and Dwight when they were running. I helped on the campaigns. But when they did that, I said, can they do that? Seriously. And that's part of the beauty of having Joe and Dwight in that position, is because they knew that they could get away with it. They knew they could do it, although it all had to be tested in court point by point over time.
Yeah, it was, the downzoning hearing was pretty hostile. They had to put TV sets outside the courthouse and in the hallways because the whole area was jam-packed with, I don't know if it ever got counted, but it was the biggest crowd I ever saw that came to that hearing. But it was quite a change because there was a Dallas developer, the guy that did at Woodlands north of Houston, who owned Owl Creek, and he was planning a whole nother ski area between Buttermilk and Snowmass.
It's George Mitchell.
Yeah, George Mitchell. And when we changed 55 unit an acre zoning to 1 unit per 35, kind of made that project go away. We also had Jimmy Smith.
But he still sent us a flat of grapefruit every Christmas. Though.
Yeah. Yeah, we were trying to control Snowmass too, and did at first, but they had already got so much inertia or steamroller going that they just, got the people out there who were all pro-development to create their own town, and that's how they got out from under the county zoning. But we were trying to keep them at a rational rate, but obviously they escaped and have created an urban environment out there. Can't even see the mountain from the base village now. But we also had an incident.
And that's why they incorporated, by the way.
Yeah.
The town of Snowmass incorporated because they didn't like them damn regulations that these guys were imposing.
Yeah. And we managed to save the North Star Nature Preserve area. Jimmy Smith had planned a bunch of condos there, and they were going to extend a ski lift down into that area and do a bunch of development to the east of town. And we got the Nature Conservancy involved and managed to stop that project, work out a deal to create the North Star Nature Preserve.
That was the first big county open space purchase.
And
Now there's a lot of them.
and then we had you know, you and I and John Denver flew Michael and myself to Washington, D.C. to get the Federal Forest Service to buy Hunter Creek because McCullough Oil Company was planning a subdivision up in Hunter Creek. And we were successful, and John played him a song, and they voted to have the Forest Service buy it, so that's why you've got Hunter Creek.
I got to tell you about the John Denver part of it. Before we went, we knew we were going to go to this House committee hearing, and he called me up and he said, "Look, what I'm thinking about doing is singing this song that I just wrote. It's about Alaska, but it doesn't mention Alaska. It's about wilderness." And while he's saying this to me, I'm going, "Oh my God, I've been to these hearings before. You don't sing." And I said, "John, geez, I'm not sure that's a good idea." He says, "Well, I think I'm going to try it." You know how he was. And so when it got to be, what you do with those hearings is you sign up. There's a long list of people that you sign up for, and that sign up for it. And by the time his name came up on that list, every staffer in one of those, in the House office building, which is like the size of downtown Aspen, was in the room. And when they call, and in those hearings, what you typically, nobody's listening. You get up there and testify, and there's a couple of staffers and a couple of Congress people, and everybody's talking, and it's just this cacophony going on. So they call on John's name. He picks up his guitar and walks to the front of the room, and by the time he gets to the front of the room, there is not a sound in the room. He's got him in the palm of his hand, and he totally nailed it, which I thought was going to be a catastrophe. He knew what he was doing.
That's amazing. That's amazing. And shout out, I don't have any idea if she's here, but Sarah Pletz for continuing John Denver's efforts by singing at council meetings recently.
Did she? Oh, great.
Yeah, she's been doing it. I love it. All right, so this is a two-parter. The first part's short, it's for Joe, and then I want to turn it over to you, Michael.
I got to tell you that. Well, wait, did you all notice the numbers that Joe talked about? What would have been Hunter Creek? What would have been Wildcat? What would have been Owl Creek? It would have been Aurora or worse. And Joe and Dwight stopped that. And there's an important thing I want to say about that too is that I get a lot of the credit for having been part of that. It was really Joe and Dwight that did it. I was just the guy that came in later and helped out. I mean, I did a lot on housing, but those guys are the ones that did it. So when you hear Dwight and Joe and Michael, it's really Dwight and Joe who did it. And I wish Dwight could be here today. He was a hero and a tough son of a bitch. And unfortunately, he died on us and is not here tonight.
No, that's beautiful to say. To that end, the first part of the question is just, how hot did it really get? I've heard stories of people offering you special presents, for instance. So I'd love for you to kind of comment on maybe some of the largest threats that came forward. And then the follow-up question, and Michael, maybe this isn't for you, given what you just said, but I think of you as you know, sort of the cool water in the room sometimes. So I'm really curious about how you balanced at this time both a clearly demonstrable effort to build consensus, but also taking action through very, very strong opposition.
Before he does that, just a quick side note. On that sidewalk right out there, when the gas station was here, Hans Grumminger, the guy that Bill was talking about that wanted to do he threatened to kill me right out on that sidewalk one evening. And Joe had several similar invitations over time.
That's what I'm hoping he'll talk about.
Well, the I'm thinking of at the time I was elected, Darcy Brown was ahead of the. Do you remember what they called themselves? They had a group that they'd put together, and anyway, this is how hot it got. They hired the county surveyor to determine whether I was really within the precinct, the county precinct. They had 3 at the time. And it turned out that the dividing line was defined as the intersection of Capitol Creek and the Roaring Fork, not Capitol Creek. Anyway, the dividing line went between my barn and my cabin. I lived in a little cabin. The first house ever built at Aspen Highlands was a 425 square foot cabin, and that was my house. And Lenny Lookner, who ran the bar, had built what looked like a house, but it was really just a barn and a storage thing. But it was larger than the cabin. They mistook the barn for the house and announced that I couldn't take office because my house was in the wrong precinct. The dividing line happened to run between the two. And Dwight drew a cartoon where they were instructing surveyors on the difference between a horse and a county commissioner. Because I did have horses out there. And it was quite an embarrassment for them, but they were trying on that technicality to prevent me from taking office. It was a very hot, contested, there was a lot of animosity there. And after we were planning to do the downzoning, the most direct threat I had was Wayne Wagner one night at a caucus meeting in the Woody Creek area, said, some night when you leave your office at the Wheeler and enter the alley, I'm going to be there with my pickup and my 30-30, and I'm going to shoot you right between the eyes. Said it right to my face at this caucus meeting. But it was pretty hostile, and there were a lot of threats. The sheriff had half a dozen threats on my life in his file, and Dwight too.
Wayne's threat was far more credible than the one that I received out on the sidewalk here.
Yeah.
It was very credible.
Hans was quite a character. We had, the one thing we never got done was the light rail system. Dwight and I had gone to Europe, hired a German engineer. They designed a light rail system between Snowmass through Owl Creek, stopping at the airport and into town. And it was costed, it was designed, the alignments were surveyed, it was ready to go. But Hans Grumminger thought that the rail going on the Midland right-of-way past his planned restaurant on Shadow Mountain would be imperiled by the train going by there, so that he went to Washington at the budget hearing for UMTA, the Urban Mass Transit Administration, and created such a stink and public brouhaha at that meeting that the budget committee said, well, Philadelphia is really in need of a lot of buses for them, and since we thought there was unanimous support, which generally there was for the light rail system in Aspen, they decided to fund Philadelphia instead of us. But they were willing to fund that light rail system as a demonstration grant, and they were interested in trying to get it established in this country. And it was ready to go. And that's a shame. It's one thing we just didn't get done. And it was because of Grominger. He just had a hissy fit at this budget meeting, and they said, well, if there's not unanimous support there, let's switch the money over here. And that was a shame, because it might have, I mean, now your whole town is a parking lot now. And we were trying to figure out a way to make that unnecessary. We had an intercept lot at the airport, and people would get on this light rail system. And we preserved the right-of-way all the way down to Glenwood with the thought that it eventually would extend down to there. And it would have been a lot better than the bumper-to-bumper traffic you've now got on 82.
Thank you. So two last sort of policy questions, and then I'm going to kind of open the aperture a little bit and to all of you guys. Michael, Joe talked about, as I read it, one of two things from the initial platform that didn't substantially get done. One was light rail and transit in the valley. The other was related, the initial vision of mall it all to the downtown core. And we did get the walking malls, but substantially incomplete. So can you comment on maybe what the dynamics were that allowed all these other things that were also very controversial to move forward, but did not allow that to move forward?
The mall? I think Joe's in a better position to talk about that, yeah.
Well, the mall happened a couple of years after the hippie trial. And what happened is a girl by the name of Kathy Ducher was a senior at Aspen High and went to San Francisco or Oakland to go to school, and ran into Margot Dick, who was the daughter of Nancy Dick, who was the lieutenant governor at that time. And her boyfriend had died on Aspen Mountain by skiing into an air shaft from one of the mines. And I can't remember his name. But anyway, she wanted to do something in her mind that was good for the town to remember him by. And they had the idea of the mall. So they walked into my office and said, how can we cause a mall to happen in Aspen? And so I drafted an initiative ordinance, and they took it around, sat at the post office, and got enough signatures to compel the city to put a mall in, which they didn't really want to do because it costs money, and it was universally opposed by all of the people that were on what's now the mall. They thought that it would destroy their business if people weren't able to drive their car right up to the door. So we presented the initiative ordinance to the city council, and they have a choice under the statute to either adopt it or set it for an election. And for the reasons of the $40,000 cost of the election, they said, well, we'll try it, even though it was unanimously opposed by all of the shop owners along it. And initially, we were going to extend it further east a couple of blocks, but because of the filling station right here where we're sitting, and the filling station where Cookie Munchers is, we decided to just have it be one block instead of 2 or 3. We also wanted to move it a block north, but we were apprehensive that the firehouse being there would be enough of a constraint to discourage people from voting for that. But in any way, that's how it got built. Initially, volunteers on this trial basis put a bunch of railroad-tied planters together to block the streets, and it was such a bonanza success for the business community that suddenly they became advocates for it instead of opponents of it. Most did, and I think it was a big good deal. Anyway, that's how it happened as a memorial to this. Boy, why can't I remember his name? I'm getting too old. I can't remember names. I never could remember names, and now I really can't.
So, Joe, I'd like to kind of seg on the mall because the critics of the mall ridiculed this idea of creating a pedestrian streets for 3 streets, and their attack in the newspaper, which was the ultimate criticism, was they said they called it the $1 million mall, which that's what it cost us for all the pavers that we bought from the city of St. Louis, and we created those 2 little drainage ways because we got the idea from the Aspen Institute, because they had those wonderful little 18-inch wide ditches, so that we picked up the water from the Durant mine and brought that through the center of town, and then basically it all circulated down and was used to irrigate the Rio Grande Park. So it was a pretty clever idea, but can you imagine $1 million to completely repave, change all of the utilities? And there's some just wonderful war stories about how our mall got built. And we had Jim Furness was the project manager. Remember Furness? And so Jim was in a big hurry trying to get this project going. We only had 90 days in the summer. So he called for a utility location, so a surveyor to come out and locate where all this was. Mountain Bell at the time. So it was all copper wire phone. And so he called them and they said, well, your call is not very timely. We can get to the site October 1st. This was in May, and we were trying to build this mall. So he tried everything. He pulled every string he could, and they were being pretty they were resistive to the idea, I'll say that. So Jim went out the next day with his backhoe. He knew where the 16-pair wire was that serviced the whole mall. He put the bucket down and scraped all the wires. They were out there in 45 minutes. True story. And there were more of those deals like that had to be done. But that's the way Aspen operated in 1970. It was built in 1976, the mall. And it started with these temporary, and Joe and Margot Dick, Nancy Dick, got the council to approve it, and there were just so many wonderful stories. You know, the Uncle Willie's Spirit House was there. He was one of the main opponents, and he explained to everybody at public hearings that he made his living by selling beer to the softball teams in Aspen, and probably true. They all whipped up to their pickup trucks after softball, and he said, I have no alternative business here. And they said, well, how about wine and spirits, other things? And he said, I know nothing about wine. People in Aspen don't buy wine. And we said, that can't be right. So at any rate, we went forward and built the mall, and our office, Stacy Stanley and I had an office in the building on Hyman Street, up above the Super Place and right by Paragon. And so I was walking home one night and I stopped in there for a 6-pack or something to go into Uncle Willie's Spirit House. And here was Uncle Willie, the man who had complained vociferously that he couldn't possibly sell wine. He was talking to a couple that were looking around, and they said, well, we're having a roast, we're looking for a red. And he said, I have a particularly nice 1978 Cabernet that I think would pair beautifully. So now he was like the great wine expert, and he made a killing.
I for one, am truly grateful, as many I'm sure are, that you guys had both the vision and the courage to push through. And on cue, Mr. Kinsley. So the last piece I want to touch on specifically is affordable housing. it has been the perennial issue for us as a community. And in many ways, more than anyone, Michael, we have you to thank for initiating that system. So I'd like for you to kind of talk about that process, when, where, how, and how it came to be.
Very slowly it came to be. For me, it was not an abstract issue because I was one of the worker bees who didn't have a place to live. So I was pushing for it, at least based in part on that. Golly, I'm not sure I remember much of the details. Bill is the only one of the three of us here who can remember any of the details about it.
I do remember. So
You want to take the microphone?
So the first big adventure was not only doing survey work and trying to identify the need for housing, but this is another Joe and Dwight kind of brilliant idea. So the first project that we undertook was Midland Park. So we formed a housing authority in 1976, I think. Brian Goodheim was our first director. Richie Cummins is here. Richie was an antagonizer, I think, in those days. And
Brian invented the basic framework for housing as we know it now, with the deed restrictions and the requirement and all the criteria and all that stuff.
yeah. So, but what I was going to say is that Midland Park was, we couldn't figure out how to do this. Joe and Dwight cooked up this idea to actually issue a bond. And so the homeowners that bought their unit were actually making bond payments. They didn't have mortgages. We were all making payments on the bond, and the counties had basically lien on the property. And so the interest rate was some alarming 1.9 or 2%, and that was in 77. So that was a time when interest rates were 12, 13%. So it was an ingenious project, and I think there are people still living there. So
Was it generally accepted to extend public credit and funds towards this new sort of second tier home?
Up to be dead honest, I think most people didn't know what was happening. I think it just kind of, people were sort of mystified by the whole kind of, because what came with it was the whole.
There were plenty of people who thought that it wasn't the role of government
Right, of course.
to be involved in the housing market, that if
Right.
we just get rid of all the damn zoning, that there'd be enough supply that we could have plenty of affordable housing. That was definitely a point of view. But in general, it sort of happened under the radar.
It did, and what came with it, though, was the right of first refusal and the appreciation cap. So these are all ownership housing, so people had to agree that they would not realize more than, excuse me, sound like Joe Edwards. So that this would not exceed the Denver-based CPI index. And so people agreed to right of first refusal, so the county had the right to take back the units, and then they would be compensated at the appreciation rate levered against the entire price of the unit. So the first units were ungodly expensive. I think the first unit was $72,000 for a 3-bedroom, 1977.
Nice.
Not too bad. So that started it, and then it kind of rolled from there. I think that we encouraged, and then we adopted what we were calling inclusionary housing. So then we passed ordinances, both city and county, that required a specific commitment that you guys are working with today. I think you've improved upon it quite a bit, but that was the initial concept. So.
I want to comment on that because I remember we were looking for land to build the first for sale affordable housing, and Midland Park was it. We bought this mining claim from a guy in Florida at the base of Smuggler, and George was our county manager at the time, George Oakes, and he kind of ramrodded the construction, the design, and construction of these units, and they were the first for sale, not rent. So these people would be able to build equity over the years. And a girl who turned out to be my secretary later had bought the corner unit and the first one, and I think she's still there. That's 20 plus years after. So it was 40. Oh God. Anyway, that was the concept we came up with to allow people to be able to not just have a rental, but to be able to build some equity. And it's worked out. Could be expanded, probably should be expanded. We had some other things that I wanted to mention, which was the sheriff. One of the confrontations back about the time I got, shortly after the hippie trial, was the city police had, and the sheriff was involved too, had hired an undercover agent. So this agent was going around entrapping the younger people who wanted to smoke marijuana. Oh, you know. Yeah, late 60s. And so, you know, Hunter decided to make his run for sheriff after in the same time period, and his platform was to run the bad drug dealers, to pillory them on the courthouse, and
Not the drug dealers, the bad drug dealers.
yeah. And to pave, to sod all the streets, get rid of the pavement, and to take all the bad developers and run them somewhere. But that was a sort of a facetious campaign that got crazy in itself, because the existing sheriff hired an undercover guy to come from Denver and infiltrate Hunter's campaign headquarters, which were in the Jerome Hotel, and offer Hunter machine guns and cocaine and other drugs to try to entrap him. And then that got blown because one of the police officers with the city was friendly with and sympathetic to Hunter and told him about this. So Aspen Times reporter went over to Denver and interviewed this undercover guy, and the whole thing got blown into the public. It was quite a to-do. But the bottom line was that Hunter wound up losing by about, he actually won in the city, and the outer line areas, the ranchers, he wound up losing by about 270 votes. And the time when I lost by 6 votes, and would have won by about 10 or 12 if they had counted the late arriving mail-in ballots. So it was a time of turmoil and contention, and the realtors and the contractors were our biggest opponents, and they just knew we were going to create an economic apocalypse.
One point I would add about what these guys waxed philosophical about what it was like in those days, and of course those of us who were in those days can wax philosophical ad nauseum about that. And my brother says that the best thing about being in Aspen in the 70s was being in your 20s. But that aside, the overarching feeling, Bill talked about the feeling, Joe talked about that happiness, the overarching feeling of the place, if you can imagine that now, for those of you who are here relatively late in the game, it was unpretentious. There was no pretense. You literally could not tell the rich people from the poor people. If you can imagine that today, was the way Aspen was in the 60s and 70s and deep into the 80s as well.
Yeah, cool. So I'm going to switch to a few kind of quick hitter questions. Any of you guys can take them at will, but try to keep them concise, and then we will have at least 15 minutes for questions from the audience, because I'm sure you guys have many. The first one is sort of consensus versus force, right? There was a lot of effort to build consensus and bring community in, and yet there was strong action through intense opposition. So how did you guys balance those things?
A quick point in the front. Joe can get into it very deeply. When Joe and Dwight came in, their platform was unambiguous and highly detailed. So when they began doing some things that were outrageous in many ways, they shouldn't have been a surprise to anybody, because they'd already said, and that sharply contrasts to most people who run for office, including some of them who are running for office in this election, which is they've said nothing about what they're going to do when they get in office. Look at the number of people who are running for city council and mayor right now who've said essentially nothing about what they'll do when they get in office. Now, regardless of whether they'll do a good job, do you want to vote for somebody who hasn't said what they're going to do? And that's sharply contrasted to what these guys did. They had a detailed program. So when they got elected, they had a clear, unambiguous mandate to go for it. And by the way, that means a lot to courts too, when these kinds of issues get challenged by developers.
That's okay. So all the complexity in the system, then and now, feature, bug, or both? All the complexity in the system, the 15 years of land use approval, feature, bug, or both?
Well,
Is it a feature of the system, or is it a problem of the system,
Yeah.
or is it both?
So,
Computer parlance, my bad.
I think maybe harking back to the original question, which was how do you make decisions? Do you wait for consensus, or ultimately do you make the decision? And I think in our days when we were really doing this, I think we had a very extensive public hearing process, and we gave people plenty of time, and people had a chance to really vent. And we did the growth management plan. We had over 40 public hearings, and it was a very tough call, because I think people thought that this was it. This was going to be the ultimate heavy hand of government, and there was going to be no, private sector initiative, and so there was a lot to worry about. And so we spent most of the time not talking about the numbers, but talking about philosophically where we were going. And I think we kind of talked it to death, and the decision was never easy, but it was a lot easier after. Yeah, as you guys say now, it wasn't, everybody, it was all said, it just wasn't all said by everybody, but so we waited for everybody. And so I remember the approval of the growth management plan was, you were there, these guys voted for it. And it wasn't easy, but it was, I think we wore them down, kind of.
Yeah, that's great.
One other thing we learned was that people can get crazy if you're not careful. And sometimes at a public hearing, the opponents would stand up and say, we think you're wrong or bad or communists or whatever. And then the next guy would stand up with his hard hat and his baseball bat and say, and I'm going to bash your head in. I mean, it would feed on itself, kind of a crowd craziness. And the way we learned to sort of blunt that dangerous craziness was we would have Dottie Fox and her friends come in, and when somebody'd stand up and say, you guys are full of it, and they would stand up and say, next. Oh, that's a great idea. So it brought balance to the hearing. You kind of had to expect hostility. It's not comfortable to sit up there and to be threatened and to be yelled at but by bringing in your supporters to have them balance the conversation in the room, it kept it from getting out of control. And so, sometimes I would drive by the softball field on a way to a hearing, and the parking lot would be full of cars, and I'd pull up to our hearing, and I'd say, where are all the people that should be here that we're trying to help build some housing for? We actually had to actively solicit their participation. One other thing I want to mention is that when we first took office, the first thing we did was have a professor from the University of Colorado come and analyze what our growth rate was, what had been built in the several years before we took office. Aspen area was growing at 17.5% per year, which doubles every 3.5 years. So that's what we were looking at for the future. And instead, we approved the downzoning, which essentially stopped a lot of that growth until things could sort themselves out. And downzoning from 55 units an acre to 1 per 35 put the squelch on that. And it would be a different area if we hadn't, right at that moment, stopped that crazy rate of growth.
That's great. And you actually kind of answered my next question, which was just how do you deal with all of that incoming personally, emotionally? And what I heard is, you make sure you have supporters and friends in the room. You actively cultivate them coming in, and maybe a little Hotel Jerome bar.
There was a real meeting. I don't know if, it'd be interesting to look it up in the Aspen Times. Not to dramatize this, but this was a Baltimore gym encounter called the Axe Handle meeting. And it actually did occur. And it was, these guys showed up and stood in the back of the room. This is Aspen City Council meeting. There were times when it wasn't quite as genteel as it was others, but that one was pretty, that was a little bit scary. And the item got tabled rather quickly, and those gentlemen were escorted out of the room. And it came back up later in the night, and the sheriff was there, and the city police chief was there, and everything calmed down, but it was a little spooky there for a while.
I hear that.
There was an element of humor to it, but you didn't know how humorous they were being.
So I think two more, and then we'll turn it over to the crowd. This is sort of an elephant in the room question for me, which is you all played such a huge role in the character and development of this town, but all of you live mid or down valley at this point. So how was that decision made personally, and what, if anything, does it portend for your view of how it's all gone in the long run?
I wound up down valley because I took a sabbatical and took our family sailing for 3 years. And when we came back, my girls were old enough, they wanted horses. And I had 2 horses at Aspen Highlands, but it wasn't really very good for a horse operation on a 3/4 acre lot. So we moved down to Mesirow Heights and bought a place that had a barn and a riding rink. And Lena became the state champion and amateur owner jumper. And for a decade or so, we had horses and just sold the last one last summer. So that was the reason I wish I hadn't sold my house at Aspen Highlands, because frankly, I wouldn't mind being back there. And I didn't really need to at the time. I just got tired of lessees breaking the lease.
I can certainly tell my tale. We lived in Aspen for 39 years, and we spent our freshman year at Gene Law's apartments, which was at Hyman and Garmisch, right by the Mouse House. So, anybody remember that? I think he was. I think Kinsley was there. And so, we basically worked our way through the Aspen food chain, and we spent our last years at Meadowwood, and I see Steve Wicks in the back there. He's still running Meadowwood. And it just, we thought that was going to be our retirement home, and we would, spend our last days up in Meadowwood. And there was an unusual ruling from a local court which basically attributed FAR from the 39-acre meadow in the center of Meadowwood to all the individual residences. So the FAR went from, 2,900 square feet to big houses. Our house was 2,600 square feet. Now it's 8,800 square feet. And so the reality for us was we got our first assessment when all the utilities had to be oversized and streets had to be replaced to service the big residences that came in. So it was a pretty easy decision. It was an economic decision. This wasn't going to be our retirement house, so that's just the way it was, and we love being where we are. I reflect on the reality that when we lived in Aspen, the truth is we only lived in Aspen before the canyon was improved. And in the Mid-Valley, you live in the Roaring Fork Valley. And it's a different kind of case. And love Aspen to death. I will never, in all my days, say a bad word about this town because it just has done so much for us in our kind of self-actualization and life and experience of the outdoors. And, it's just the best. But, you got to do what you can do. So that's my answer.
So for me, it was simple. An Apcha house became available in Old Snowmass, so I got the thing. I got real lucky in a lottery. So just dumb luck. And now I love living in Old Snowmass, and I'm part of the caucus there. Let me say one other thing is that one way of interpreting your question is that, well, all of this restrictive zoning you guys did pushed you out in addition to everybody else. I think that there is a lot of people in this valley who believe that's true. So let's think about whether that's in fact true. Eagle County, which had essentially no land use rules for 40 or plus years during the time that we were having very restrictive rules. In Eagle County, which economy is as similar as one can imagine to the Pitkin County economy, and I'm thinking the Gore Valley part of Eagle County, that housing is unaffordable in that county as well. So if it's unaffordable there and unaffordable here, if there was tough restrictions here and none there, it shows you the restrictions were not the cause. What was the cause was demand. I think economists call it inelastic demand, where folks can pay virtually anything, and certainly a lot more than anybody who's a working person. So it wasn't the restrictions that caused the prices to go. It was a whole other set of factors that we really couldn't deal with, that we couldn't control. And Mick Ireland can speak to that at length, his understanding of federal law and tax law that has that has separated the classes in this country so badly as it has.
Yeah, I would just like to add on to that, because that's a conversation I had with Joe Edwards 100 years ago, but we were really searching our souls about what the effect of all of the land use regulations were going to have. And the conversation was that we have some choices here. One is we can squander the physical environment and just, develop every square inch of developable land in the valley, and then be done under the sort of aegis of saying that we were going to provide housing that would be affordable for folks. And I think the conclusion was that, as Michael just said, our choice was to preserve the physical environment of the valley and then just take our chances with the social environment. And, we've created an impossibly expensive place. And if we had developed all of the meadows and all the steep slopes and basically given up on our environmental ethic, the valley would be completely built out, and it would still be the most expensive place in the western United States. Almost no doubt about that, just because of the physical attributes that we have here. So,
Yeah. So last question, and then we'll turn it over to you guys. Kind of two ways to think about this question. Pick whichever one makes the most sense to you. But one would be, knowing what you know now from all of your experience, if you had the energy and verve of your 20s, maybe you do, but if you did, and a magic wand, what would you do to address this moment? And if that sort of conjugation doesn't work for you, another way to think is, if you could impart your energy and magic wand and spirit from the 70s to the people in this audience, what would you hope they would do with it? You're going to need a microphone for either one.
Very straightforward. I would have bought a lot of land. Sorry, I didn't. I would, as a county commissioner, through the county would have purchased a hell of a lot of land and banked it to eventually become affordable housing in all of the appropriate locations for affordable housing. And by the way, as a broad point of view, every possible affordable housing site from here to Quebec, there's 6 good reasons not to do it. So when you think about the lumber yard, when you think about any project, think about it that way. There's 6 good reasons not to do every possible places that we could build affordable housing. So in particular, and here's some genuine heresy for you, I would have built 3,000 units on the Mesirow. And all those people could walk to work. It would be, the Mesirow is gorgeous the way it is. But what if we had a village out there, an affordable housing village, we'd have a completely different community here. Now, what I tell you folks, I don't know. You figure it out.
Well, I got 2 ideas, and I will acknowledge that this is only maybe half-baked, but it is my strong intuition that say that given the current housing predicament, that we may find out that it's a lot smarter to use public finance to fund mortgages rather than trying to do vertical construction and use bricks and mortars to try to solve this problem. We got 3,000 units in APCHA. And one thought I had was that we could, so I don't know what the number is going to be for the lumberyard. You pick a number, $150 million or $200 million. If you have that, is that low?
That's low. I was just saying, Tori, did you hear that?
So, but maybe what we do, so we have this dilemma where we have over 3,000 units in APCHA. We have 1,600 that are presumably occupied by folks who have retired and are not actively engaged. That I think that's the one. I don't know, you don't know which quite numbers to follow, but that was the approximation. But how about an arrangement where we use our public financial resources to create a below market mortgage pool for young folks that want to buy and live in Aspen, and then create kind of peer-to-peer arrangement with retired folks that are in affordable housing that would love to move on but are trapped by the appreciation cap. So take the cap off, allow people to do a transaction, use public financing to allow them to buy. So if a unit under the current cap is $400,000, allow them to borrow $800,000 buy the unit, gives people a head start. They're not going to buy another house in Aspen, obviously, but it opens up all sorts of other options. And I just think that that's not the answer, but there's certainly some alchemy out there that would suggest that working smarter rather than harder and using public finance as the magic to take, and dealing with the existing housing stock then does not generate new auto trips. It doesn't generate new school-age kids. Maybe school-age kids it would, but the trip demand and the travel and all of the, and it would create another vibrant market that might support, you know, affordable restaurants and more affordable commercial. But I would give just serious thought to investigating that option before we pull the trigger on stick-built, you know, 200 and some units or whatever the number is going to be. The other idea I had was that talk to Aspen Skiing Company, and on Saturdays take all the tables and chairs away from Ajax Tavern and bring the beer deck back.
Who remembers the beer deck? Yeah.
So we have the beer deck, and we have live music, and drinks are what we used to call in the day draws, right? They were $5 draws. We go back to $5 draws on Saturday afternoons on Aspen Mountain, and you know, I guarantee you the age will plummet, and it's there are innovative things. Maybe reinvent the pub below the Wheeler. There are things the city can do, but you know, you got to find a way to inject some diversity and fun, and you know, that's it.
Pass that guy down to Joe. I'm going to use this for the audience, so pass that guy down.
I would increase the mall 2 blocks east and 1 block north. Get rid of the damn cars. We had planned an auto intercept lot out by the airport, which is now an affordable housing area. Maybe you figure out where else to put it, but you know, what you got now is a town that's a parking lot. Makes a lot of money for the city, but it sure isn't very attractive, and it's not fun to be dodging all the cars. Maybe require off-street parking, not allow on-street parking, an intercept lot parking for the people who can't park on their own house. I think some affordable housing could be built, as Michael suggested, at least on the portion of the Merault open space. And I'm the guy that started the open space and trails department. While Dwight was creating RAFTA, which is now the largest transportation area in the country for a rural area. But you know, I hate to say take some open space, but that area where Jimmy Moore's house was, over opposite the running track for the school, you could build a whole bank of buildings against that. It wouldn't be visible from Highway 82, and you're in walking distance from town. You could put a jitney service across maybe the walking bridge that already exists. I mean, those are just some quick thoughts. I haven't really thought that through, but maybe something to think about.
That's great, great. We'll turn to audience questions, but let's just get a big round of applause. Really, really, really amazing.
Just another quick note. You've heard about all the shit that we put up with back in the day. But in many ways, what we were doing was unambiguous. That it was clear we needed, the brigands were coming over the castle wall, and we took out the archers and killed those motherfuckers. And it was pretty straightforward. Right now, it's far more complicated. It's far more difficult for your elected officials. So when they do something you don't like, a little empathy would be very helpful. And in particular, you got a guy right here who is smart, who's said what he wants to do. Remember, and you got a mayor that's been. Is Tori in the room here? Yeah. So reach out to these folks. Even when they do stuff you don't like, give them a hug.
We accept and give hugs readily. So for questions, we're going to want to get you on the audio and the camera for those at home or watching later. So if you have a question, I know it may be awkward, but I'm going to invite you to come out here and sit right here and get intimate with us, and I'll hand you the microphone, and you can be here for the answer and then go back. So just come up in whatever order suits you. You want to pass it instead? All right. We'll let you raise a hand if you want it. Wow. Never happened.
A lot of wisdom went through that mic tonight.
How much of the work you all did is set in stone through easements or conservation or what have you, including with the down zoning, and how much of it can be undone by people in positions of power today?
Let me, a quick one there. One of the things that I feared about the affordable housing program back in the day was when we get a couple of thousand people in these units, they can be a constituency that can easily dump all of the restrictions and cash in. And there's never been any effort to do that. I think that's really interesting. All this stuff can go away with a few signatures. All of it can go away. That's on you all to keep the faith and to hold the line and to support the people who keep this effort going over time, because it can go away really quickly. That's not true with a lot of the open space program. A lot of that stuff is locked into contract, but a lot of it can go away really easily. And that's one of the great things about what Skippy said at the beginning was that, I forget how you said it, that we all sort of just assume this is the way it is, right? This isn't the way it is. This is the way you all made it. The great thing about, I mean, Joe and Dwight were heroes, are heroes that did a great thing. But what it made it possible was a remarkable constituency that allowed the local government to do outrageous things and experimental things. So when your government today does things that are outrageous and experimental, you know, comment on it, but don't give them a hard time for trying.
We can do another big round of applause.
Yeah, I was appointed to the Open Space and Trails Board for the county back in 1990 when the voters voted it in. And when I took the job and was interviewing with the county commissioners, I told them that the hardest thing was going to be advocating for open space. And at the same time, the county would be wanting land to build on for affordable housing. So, and I told them, I said, it's going to be a big controversy between the two programs. And what's happened since 1990 is we've bought a lot of open space. We've preserved through conservation easements, a lot of other tools, and the open space program is fantastic. It's modeled after the one in Boulder. But our affordable housing stock has dwindled relative to demand and relative to, as Joe said, you know, having a affordable village on the Mesirow would be ideal for the town per se. But would you ever consider, you did a lot of down zoning. Would you ever consider upzoning?
I would if it was deed restricted. Yeah, absolutely. That's why I've said what I said about the Merle. I think I'm on the open space board now too, and I think about that all the time. Are there any parcels that we have, the county has, that would be better placed as affordable housing? If there are any, there aren't many, because most of them are far away from transit. But we should think about that. It's a very good point.
On the lighter side, who decided no neon in town?
I don't think anybody ever decided that.
You know, I read an article by a realtor who suggested that we stop advertising the town. And I think that's a good suggestion. And our Aspen Chamber said they're going to stop advertising the off-season. They were soliciting visitors to come in the off-season, and the place is getting a little nuts. And so I think it might be time to stop. I mean, there's going to be enough visitors anyway. We don't need any more.
Last question. Melissa?
Hi, my name's Melissa. I like to call Aspen my forever home, but I've only lived here for 7 years. So my question for you guys is kind of twofold. What aspects or what's the aura of Aspen from the past that you still see in the town today, as well as what is the same thing that you wish the town still had today?
Aspen still has Spar Gulch. Spar to the Bar is alive and well. I got a guide over here to prove it. And, the outdoor environment is still here and is still wonderful and as great as it's ever been. And the thing that is utterly incomparable about Aspen, Colorado is that you'd have pristine wilderness jammed up against world-class buildings. And there's no place like it. And so that's all still here. Just we'd all like it to be a little more affordable, I guess. But the fact is that this is a jewel, and it's the wonderful contrast between outdoors and culture is just unparalleled. I just don't know where else it exists in the world. I was telling Skippy about an episode where everybody has their own personal sort of highlight of Aspen, Colorado. I had the experience of climbing Pyramid Peak and hearing Aaron Copland conduct the Aspen Orchestra in one weekend. Try doubling that one. That's pretty crazy. So it's all still here, and we're going through cycles, and it's just so encouraging that everybody is in this room is here, because we just all still care about these crazy issues and this crazy place. So my thought, but the skiing's as good as everyone, and we're gonna have a World Cup race on Friday. With the best of the world are going to be here, and they love this hill. It's the best. So Roach Cup is it. So.
I think it's still really magical. I went skiing last Sunday on HX at 83, and I'm not very good anymore, but I think skiing is a great thing to do. You just can't be angry after a day of skiing. It's just takes all of your need for energy or something, it's a magical experience. So keep doing that. And the one thing it's just the friendliness, and you know, you walk down the street and people are smiling and people are happy, and that's not so in most places. And so I really feel comfortable in that space.
Michael, anything? No? Well, I will just say, to close this out, that community is the relationships between one another, but it is also the continuity of our story. And the obligation is on each of us to keep that alive. And we will owe these gentlemen a great applause for being here and sharing their experience with us. And in turn, they will owe you one, because this is the most RSVPs Here House has ever had, which tells us we still care about this story. So back and forth.